Welcome back to tonight's broadcast, a place for stories. For most people, camping alone is a way to escape the noise of everyday life. But when darkness falls and help is miles away, that peaceful isolation can become something else entirely. Tonight, we have two frightening stories from the South Texas border, one involving a killer on the run, and another connected to an old warning from Mexican folklore. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Hello, tonight's broadcast. My name is Rafael Garza. I'm 28 years old and from Laredo, Texas. I work as a diesel mechanic, and anyone who has spent time inside a repair shop knows that it is never quiet. There are air tools screaming, engines running, people shouting over machinery, and phones constantly ringing. That is probably why I started camping alone. My father used to take me fishing when I was a kid. He taught me how to make a fire, clean a fish, read the weather, and find my way back to camp without relying on a phone. After he passed away, I kept going. Camping became the one place where I could think clearly. I usually stayed at established campgrounds, but a customer from the shop owned some land near Falcon Lake outside Zapata. His property included a rough stretch of shoreline that hardly anyone used. He told me I was welcome to camp there whenever I wanted. The location was remote, but it wasn't completely inaccessible. A narrow caliche road led from the highway through several miles of thorny brush before reaching the water. I chose a weekend in late October. Before leaving Laredo, I sent my sister the location and told her I would call her on Sunday morning. I arrived a little after 4 Friday afternoon. The campsite was exactly what I was hoping for. There was a flat clearing above the shoreline surrounded by mesquite, cactus, and dry grass. A shallow arroyo cut through the land about 50 yards from camp. On the opposite side, the brush continued for miles. I parked my truck beside the clearing and set up my tent. I brought a small orange fishing kayak, a cooler, a folding chair, and a portable weather radio. Phone service was weak, but the radio could receive emergency broadcasts from the area. By sunset, I already felt better. The lake was calm, and the only sounds were insects in the grass and the occasional splash near the shoreline. At around 8, I cooked some fajitas on my stove, put the leftovers in my cooler, and sat beside the fire. That was when I noticed another light. It was across the arroyo, deep inside the brush. At first, I thought it was a star visible between the branches. Then it flickered. Someone had built a small campfire. I wasn't supposed to have neighbors. The landowner had specifically told me that no one else would be on the property. Still, I wasn't immediately frightened. Property lines could be difficult to recognize out there. A hunter or fisherman could have entered from the neighboring ranch without realizing it. I watched the light for several minutes. I never saw anyone move around it. Eventually, the fire disappeared. I assumed whoever had built it had put it out. Around 10, I locked my food inside the cooler, checked the shoreline, and crawled into my tent. I had almost fallen asleep when I heard gravel crunching outside. It sounded like one careful step, then another. I sat up and listened. The sound stopped. I reached for my flashlight and waited. After nearly a minute, I unzipped the tent and shined the light across camp. Nothing was there. My truck was exactly where I had left it. The chair beside the fire was empty. The brush surrounding the clearing was completely still. I checked behind the truck and walked to the edge of the arroyo. There was no flashlight or fire on the opposite side. I convinced myself that I had heard an animal. When I returned to my tent, however, I noticed my cooler lid was open. I knew I had closed it. One of the food bags had been pulled out and left on the ground. A package of tortillas was missing. That should have been enough to make me leave. Instead, I blamed a raccoon or some other animal clever enough to open the latch. I closed the cooler and placed a heavy toolbox on top of it. Before going back to bed, I noticed several tracks in the dust beside my truck. They were boot prints. The prints began near the arroyo and ended beside my cooler. I followed them with my flashlight, but after a few yards, the ground became too rocky to hold a track. I stood there listening to the darkness. Somewhere across the arroyo, a branch snapped. I went straight to my truck. My plan was to pack my things in the morning and sleep inside the locked cab until sunrise. I turned on the weather radio while arranging a blanket across the back seat. A weather report played first. Then an emergency message interrupted it. The announcement said law enforcement officers were searching ranchland north of Zapata for an armed suspect connected to the deaths of 2 people at an isolated home earlier that afternoon. The suspect had abandoned a stolen vehicle near the highway and disappeared into the brush. Residents were being advised to lock their doors and report anyone walking around rural roads. The description was brief. A man in his 40s wearing work boots, dark pants, and a faded canvas jacket. I looked towards the arroyo. The distant campfire made sense now. So did the missing food. Someone wasn't camping across from me. Someone was hiding. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The dashboard lights came on, but the engine did nothing. I tried again. There wasn't even a click. I opened the hood while keeping my flashlight aimed towards the brush. One of the battery cables had been cut clean through. When I walked around the truck, I found the rear tire completely flat. There was a long knife cut through the side wall. The person hiding out there had already been inside my campsite. He had disabled my truck while I was sitting only a few yards away. I locked myself in the cab and tried calling 911. The call failed. I sent my sister a message that said, "Call police, armed man near campsite." The phone showed that it was still trying to send. Then my camp lantern went out. I hadn't touched it. Through the windshield, I saw a narrow flashlight beam moving between the mesquite trees. It appeared near the arroyo, vanished, and then reappeared closer. The beam swept across my tent. It moved over the cooler. Then it turned towards my truck. I lowered myself beneath the dashboard, and the flashlight passed across the windows. Someone tried the passenger side door handle very slowly. The handle lifted once and dropped. Then it lifted again. A man's voice came from outside. "Hey buddy, you awake?" I didn't answer. He walked around the front of the truck. The suspension shifted slightly when he placed a hand against the hood. "I need some help," he said. "My truck broke down." I remained on the floor. After several seconds, he knocked gently on the driver's window. 3 taps. Not loud or desperate. Patient. "I know you're in there." My orange kayak was still near the shoreline. The water curved around the property and reached an abandoned fishing cabin on the opposite side of a small cove. I had noticed the cabin earlier through my binoculars. It was perhaps half a mile away by water. If I could reach it, I might find a stronger radio or a road. The problem was getting from my truck to the kayak. The knocking stopped. Footsteps moved towards my tent. I heard the zipper open. The man began searching through my things. I waited until the flashlight disappeared inside the tent, unlocked the rear door as quietly as possible, and slipped out on the side facing the lake. I left everything behind: my phone, boots, and most of my supplies. I only took my truck keys, life jacket, paddle, and handheld radio. I crawled down the rocky bank until I reached the kayak. When I pushed it into the water, the bottom scraped loudly against the stone. The flashlight snapped towards me. "Stop." I jumped into the kayak and paddled. A bright beam followed me across the water. Something struck the lake several feet to my right with a sharp slap. I couldn't tell if it was a rock or a bullet. I kept paddling. Behind me, the man ran along the shoreline, trying to follow the curve of the cove. I could hear branches breaking as he forced his way through the brush. The fishing cabin appeared ahead of me. Its dock was half rotten, but I managed to pull myself onto it and tie the kayak to one of the posts. The cabin door wasn't locked. Inside, I found an old marine radio connected to a battery. I turned it on and began calling for help on every channel. At first, all I heard was static. Then a fisherman answered. I gave him my name and approximate location. He contacted authorities and stayed on the radio with me while I pushed a cabinet against the cabin door. Across the water, a flashlight appeared at my abandoned campsite. It remained there for several minutes. Then it disappeared. Deputies reached the cabin shortly before sunrise. They took me back to the main road while other officers searched the ranch. Later that morning, the suspect was found hiding inside an abandoned ranch house about 3 miles from my campsite. After a short standoff, he was arrested. The investigators believed he had entered the property shortly before I arrived. They found his backpack. They also found wire cutters, a hunting knife, and a hand-drawn map of the ranch roads, along with my tortillas. One deputy told me he probably disabled my truck because his plan was to steal it after dark. But when I locked myself inside, his plan changed. The part that still bothers me came from a small trail camera the landowner had strapped to a tree near the arroyo. The camera captured the man watching me set up camp. He was already there when I arrived. In one photograph, taken just after sunset, I'm sitting beside my campfire with my back to the arroyo. The man is standing in the brush less than 30 yards behind me. In another image, taken at 12:47 in the morning, he is beside my truck holding an open knife. I never heard him approaching. I still camp occasionally, but I don't go alone anymore. Whenever I hear someone describe the wilderness as peaceful, I think about that distant fire across the arroyo. The wilderness wasn't empty that night. It only looked that way. Our first story showed us the kind of dangers a person can bring into the wilderness. But this next experience involves something much harder to explain. My name is Camila Reyes. I'm 24 and from Del Rio, Texas. I grew up in a house where silence was almost impossible. My parents, 2 younger brothers, an aunt, and my grandmother all lived under the same roof in Del Rio. There was always a television playing, somebody cooking, children visiting, or relatives talking in the kitchen. I loved my family, but quiet became something I had to search for. That was why I started camping alone. My father taught me the basics when I was a teenager. As I got older, I combined camping with my other hobby, night photography. The land around Lake Amistad had some of the clearest skies I had ever seen. On a good night, you can sit beneath the stars and feel as if the entire desert belongs to you. My grandmother never liked the idea of me being out there alone. She had grown up in Coahuila, and she carried a lifetime of beliefs and warnings with her. Most of them involved ordinary dangers: flash floods, strangers, snakes, and getting lost. But there was one warning she repeated whenever I mentioned camping at night. If you hear someone whistle from the brush, she would say, don't whistle back. When I asked why, she told me about La Lechuza. Depending on who tells the story, La Lechuza is either a witch who can take the form of a giant owl or a spirit that moves through the night searching for people who answer its call. My grandmother said it could imitate familiar voices. It might sound like a crying baby, a lost woman, or a relative calling your name. The important thing was never to answer. I never truly believed the stories, but I enjoyed hearing them. My grandmother passed away when I was 22. 2 years later, I planned an overnight photography trip to a primitive camping area northwest of Del Rio, overlooking one of the quieter sections of the reservoir. I had camped there once before with friends. The site was reached by a rough dirt trail and surrounded by limestone, cactus, and thick mesquite. There were no lights nearby, making it perfect for photographing the stars. I arrived before sunset and parked my SUV facing the road. I set up a small tent, folding chair, telescope, and camera tripod. I also carried a handheld audio recorder because I like collecting natural sounds to use with my videos. By 9, the sky was completely clear. The reservoir looked black beneath the cliffs, and the Milky Way was visible above the desert. For almost 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. Then I heard a whistle. It came from somewhere behind my campsite. It was a simple 2-note whistle. The first note was low. The second was higher and slightly longer. I turned around, expecting to see another camper on the trail. There was nobody there. I listened for footsteps or conversation. Nothing. A few minutes later, the whistle came again. This time it sounded farther away, near the water. The change in direction confused me. The path from the brush to the shoreline crossed open ground. Anyone moving between those places should have passed through my line of sight. I turned on my flashlight and searched around the campsite. I found no footprints, vehicles, or signs that anyone else was nearby. I told myself it was a bird. That explanation worked until the whistle came a third time. It sounded exactly the same, except now it came from somewhere above me. I aimed my flashlight into the mesquite branches. They moved slightly, although there was almost no wind. I saw no bird. I placed the audio recorder on my table and left it running. For the next 20 minutes, the desert became silent. Not normal nighttime silence. The insects stopped. Even the small waves against the rocks seemed to fade. The quiet made me increasingly uncomfortable, so I began putting away my camera equipment. That was when something struck the top of my tent. The fabric dipped inward and snapped back into place. I stumbled outside with my flashlight. Nothing was on my tent. There were no rocks nearby large enough to have fallen on it, and no branches hung above it. Then I heard wings. They sounded heavy, not like a small bird fluttering away. Each movement pushed enough air through the campsite to stir dust around my feet. The sound traveled into the mesquite and stopped. I decided I was leaving. I placed my camera, recorder, and backpack inside the SUV. When I returned for the tent, a voice spoke from the darkness. "Camila." I froze. The voice came from behind the mesquite trees. It was an older woman's voice, soft, tired, and familiar. "Camila, mija." My grandmother had called me that thousands of times. The voice was hers. I knew that was impossible. I also knew that grief can affect memory. Perhaps my mind was giving meaning to an animal's sound because I had already been thinking about her warnings. Then the voice said something my grandmother often said when she wanted me to come inside. "Ven, ya es tarde." Come, it's already late. I backed towards my SUV. The voice moved with me. "Camila." Now it came from the opposite side of the campsite. I remember my grandmother's warning. No matter what it sounds like, do not answer. I got inside my vehicle and locked every door. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys beneath the passenger seat. While reaching for them, something landed on the roof. The impact rocked the SUV. Metal groaned above me. I stayed below the windows. A scraping sound traveled from the rear of the roof towards the windshield. Slowly, 3 separate points dragged across the metal. The sound stopped directly above the driver's seat. Dust fell from the ceiling liner. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. Then came 3 knocks. The same patient rhythm repeated on the passenger window. When I finally looked up, nothing was outside. The campfire lantern illuminated the tent and table, but the space between the vehicle and the mesquite was empty. My keys were still missing beneath the seat. I used my phone's flashlight to find them. When I sat up again, the audio recorder was resting on the hood of my SUV. I had placed it inside my backpack. I was sure of that. Its red recording light was still on. The older woman's voice came from somewhere above the vehicle. "Mija, abre la puerta." Open the door. I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, ran for less than a second, and died. I tried again. This time, nothing happened. The interior lights began flickering. Outside, the tent fabric rippled as if something large had moved past it. The folding chair tipped over. My metal thermos rolled across the ground and stopped beneath the front bumper. I heard a whistle again. Low note. High note. Then the same pattern came from behind the vehicle. A second whistle answered from near the water. A third answered from above the roof. The SUV shifted under another heavy impact. The roof bent downward slightly. I held my grandmother's rosary in one hand and the keys in the other. I began praying quietly, careful not to respond directly to the voice. Something walked across the roof. I heard 4 deliberate steps. The weight moved from the windshield towards the rear of the vehicle. Each step made the metal flex. Then came the scratching. 3 long lines dragged across the roof. The sound was so loud that I expected the metal to tear open. When it reached the back of the SUV, it stopped. The voice spoke once more. This time, it came from inches above my head. "Camila, look at me." That was the only sentence spoken in English. My grandmother barely spoke English. The fear I felt changed at that moment. Whatever was outside wasn't my grandmother. It had simply found a voice that might convince me to open the door. I closed my eyes and continued praying. For the next hour, I heard movement circling the vehicle. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps on the gravel. Sometimes it was the heavy beating of wings. Several times, something brushed against the windows, but I refused to look. A little before 5, the sounds stopped. The insects slowly returned. I waited until sunlight appeared over the cliffs before opening the door. Nothing was in the campsite. The tent was partially collapsed, and my folding chair lay several feet from where I had left it. The SUV roof had 3 long scratches running from back to front. They were too wide and evenly spaced to have come from a tree branch. A large gray-white feather was trapped beneath the windshield wiper. I had seen owl feathers before, but this one was longer than my forearm. I put it inside an equipment case and retrieved the audio recorder from the hood. The vehicle started normally on my first attempt. When I returned to Del Rio, I showed the scratches and feather to my father. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked whether I had answered the voice. When I told him I hadn't, he said, "Good." We listened to the recording together. For most of it, there was only wind, insects, and the sound of me packing. The 2-note whistle was clearly audible. So were the impacts against the tent and SUV. The recorder captured my grandmother's voice saying my name, but it also captured something I never heard while I was inside the vehicle. Immediately after the voice said, "Open the door," another voice whispered from directly beside the recorder. It sounded like me. The voice said, "I'm already outside." I contacted a local wildlife rehabilitator and showed her a photograph of the feather. She believed it might have come from a large bird, possibly a turkey or owl, but she couldn't identify it clearly from the picture. When I opened the equipment case to bring her the feather, it was gone. The case was still latched, nothing else was missing. I have not camped alone since that night. I still photograph the stars, but I do it from established campgrounds with other people nearby. Sometimes late at night, I hear owls calling from the desert beyond my house. Most of them sound like ordinary birds. But every once in a while, I hear 2 clear notes, one low, one high. And I remember what my grandmother told me. Whatever you do, don't answer. 2 people went into the South Texas wilderness searching for peace and solitude. One discovered that a remote campsite can provide the perfect hiding place for someone dangerous. The other learned why some mornings are passed down through generations. If you believed Camila's encounter was something paranormal, or simply something she couldn't explain, one lesson connects both stories. When you're alone in the wilderness, trust your instincts and never assume that you are truly alone. Thank you for listening to tonight's broadcast, A Place for Stories. Until next time, keep your doors locked and trust your instincts. Until the shadows call again, good night.